So when you're passing down generational wealth, it's absolutely vital that you pass down not just the financial capital, but the education, the stories, the history, what I call the human, the intellectual and the social capital, because that will generate appreciation for the money. And that's vital if you want the next generation to be involved in ensuring that the wealth is retained for multiple generations.
Yeah, I think we should probably interview Hoare & Co, because that's the first time I've ever heard the Rothschilds referred to as nouveau riche.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is the single biggest mistake people make is, having made it, they don't educate the next generations on how to maintain, improve on it in that sense. So yours is not a structural approach, if I might put it, but rather a systems approach to maintaining wealth and educating the next generations in how to deal with it.
Yeah, essentially. So the problem with the professional industry, as I call it, so when I talk about the professional industry, that's accountants, my background, lawyers, financial advisors, wealth brokers, bankers, etc., is that they're mainly focused on looking after the money. But who ends up blowing the money? It's the people. So what we decided when we looked at this and we created what I call Family Prosperity, we looked at predominantly looking after the people. So we turned the system on its head and said, well, who needs to be looked after? It's the people. They need to be educated. They need to ensure that the communication systems are in place to ensure that when conflict arises, and that's the main reason why families fail, is due to conflict and not having the systems in place to deal with conflict, that those communications are had. So there's a structure in place for those families to deal with all the issues that are created through money. And conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing, by the way. Every family argues. There's no such thing as not having an argument with a family. I'm sure you're well aware of this. But it's how do you deal with that? How do you deal with those conversations? How do you deal with the argument as and when they arise? Do you have a system in place to fall back on and say, right, this is what we deal with, this is how we deal with conflict as a family, or do you just go down the route of hope? Because once a family then goes down the road of litigation, it's too late. The relationship is completely broken and the whole family will just implode. And you see this time and time again. It's irrespective of how much wealth is involved. I've seen father and son divorce over one house.
Have you purchased UK property in the last 4 years and paid stamp duty? You may have a refund waiting. Over £2 billion in stamp duties erroneously overpaid to HMRC each year. Complete our online form or give us a call to see if you are owed thousands from HMRC.
I've seen families implode over huge amounts of wealth. So the amount of money is not actually relevant per se. There's a pot of capital. There's no systems in place. The family doesn't communicate about the wealth or who's going to get the wealth or the gifting of the wealth. And that creates arguments which then spiral out of control.
So this is actually the second book you've written. Generational
Yes.
Wealth is the second book. The first book in the series was entitled?
That was the 4 Fundamentals of Family Prosperity. So that was like an introducer to this whole story of family prosperity. What is it? What's involved? The actual reasons why families fail. So there was like a 35-year piece of research that was done by Vic Prizer and Roy Williams, and they looked at 3,250 families over a 25 to 35-year period, and they uncovered the real reasons why families fail. So 60% failed because of poor communication. So poor communication leads to distrust, distrust leads to conflict, conflict leads to the family completely dissipating. 25% was because of poor education, so not educating the heirs to receive the capital. 15% was because there was no vision for the wealth. So they've created all this money and there was no, well, what do we do about it? And then the 5% was for what we classify as other reasons.
Okay.
And what did the professional industry focus on? The 5%, not the 95%, as I classify it.
And so Generational Wealth, the second book, goes deeper and into more detail?
Yeah, so when I was looking to write the second book, I wanted to create something with a bit more meat on the bone, as we say. I sourced a lady called Antoinetta Proctor, who's my co-author on this particular book. She's a private wealth lawyer. And it was just an idea in my head. I've got loads of ideas, and it ended up creating this amazing book. So I interviewed her. I said, look, you've got a lot of intellectual capital. Let's get this on paper. Let's get this out of your head. Initially, it was like a 45-minute interview, very similar to this one. That interview actually lasted about 2 hours, and I had to stop it in the end because there was just so much content in place. We transcribed that book. We transcribed that interview, and lots of content. Didn't know what to do with it. It was quite raw. I ended up going to Dubai. I was a guest speaker at a Prestel & Partner, specifically about generational wealth. Managed to get COVID, which is not fun when you're out in Dubai because you can't leave the country if you've got COVID. So I'm stuck in a room for 10 days, and well, I've got all this content. Might as well make a book out of it. And that's how the book started, should we say.